In September, the Ukrainians pulled off one of the best military deception campaigns in modern history. While the world focused on the ongoing Kherson initiative that started in mid-August, the Ukrainian military was quietly preparing for its real offensive in the east. In the late evening of September 6, the Ukrainian army launched its Kharkiv offensive. That offensive resulted in the liberation of approximately 12,000 square kilometers of territory by mid-October. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of the U.S. state of Connecticut. But how did the Ukrainians deliver the worst battlefield defeat on the Russian military since World War II? The short answer to that question is thunder runs. To understand what a thunder run is, you must go back to the U.S. experience in Vietnam. During that conflict, the NVA and VC troops realized they were outgunned in terms of armored vehicles. While lacking in armored support, these communist soldiers did have something in abundance: mines. The main highways and roads from major population centers were notoriously known for their heavy presence of mines. Because of the frequent mine threat, U.S. troops had to constantly delay their convoys while they stopped and carefully scanned the ground with metal detectors. This would result in huge traffic jams as convoys would have to stop for hours at a time. Because of this, communist troops frequently attacked American convoys while they idled on the road waiting for the engineers to give them the go-ahead that it was safe to proceed. American commanders quickly realized that the old way of doing business was costing them the tactical and eventually strategic initiative. If U.S. convoys could not reliably get to where they were going, far-flung outposts would have much more difficult times resupplying, reinforcing, and communicating with larger formations. To solve this problem, American commanders devised an ingenious idea: simply run the mines over. Because the M48 Patton tank could easily withstand the anti-personnel mines that lined most of Vietnam's roadways, the tactic was simple. M48 tanks would lead the way in front of convoys and run over all the mines. If a tank lost a track or sustained light damage, another tank could take its place and keep going. By employing this simple yet brutally effective tactic, the American military ensured that it could effectively navigate Vietnam's highways safely and efficiently. Fast forward almost 40 years, and America is now embroiled in the War on Terror. As part of that war, the United States, under President Bush's guidance, invaded Iraq under the mistaken belief that Saddam Hussein was harboring weapons of mass destruction. While we won't get into the political debate over the legitimacy of the U.S. invasion, it's clear that it was a work of military genius on America's part, thanks in no small part to the contribution of General William Wallace. Having taken command over V Corp shortly before the 9/11 attacks, General Wallace was a Vietnam veteran and prude student of history. When the U.S. study of mounted warfare in Vietnam was published in 2002, he quickly digested it and dusted off the thunder run as a viable tactic in the modern era with some twists. With its emphasis on speed and violence of action, it was the perfect strategy that could be applied to taking over a country. Before the invasion of Iraq kicked off, President Bush had been worried about the huge casualties that would ensue if a large-scale battle for Baghdad had happened. Frightened by the Russian experience in Chechnya, trying to take Grozny, and the U.S. experience in Vietnam, Bush wanted to avoid a costly city battle at all costs. Thankfully for him, General Wallace approached Central Command with such a great idea that it was eventually briefed to the president, who signed off on it personally. The plan was relatively simple. It started off by creating an inner and outer cordon around Baghdad to isolate the city. The city was then divided into 55 sectors. Once established, V Corps would create an armored convoy consisting of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. This convoy would then charge ahead at full speed into the city to attack pre-designated targets within these sectors, as well as collect real-time intelligence on Iraqi positions and defense preparations. During the Thunder Run, the convoy would only stop to evacuate crews from any destroyed vehicles. Despite seeming like a crazy suicide mission, the Thunder Run had some serious benefits. The most important benefit was creating disorder in the enemy's rear areas. Because the U.S. bombing campaign had already degraded Iraqi command and control, the fact that there was an American armored column inside the city center would create confusion and panic amongst the Iraqis, because there was no way to tell how far into the city the Americans advanced. The second benefit was that it acted like reconnaissance in force. Even with the state-of-the-art surveillance, drones, and aircraft the U.S. operated, human intelligence was still lacking. By getting American troops up close to the city, they could accurately report on enemy strength, weapons locations, morale, and other information vital to the war effort. The third benefit was that U.S. commanders meant the operation to be a psychological operation against the Iraqi people and the government. Before and during the Thunder Runs, General Wallace had television broadcasts playing what the Saddam regime was saying about the war. By penetrating deep into Baghdad, he could prove the regime was dead wrong about the war and hopefully break the will of the Iraqis to avoid a costly house-to-house battle. Crazy enough, the plan worked even better than expected. After the first Thunder run penetrated almost to the presidential palace, the second one went in and occupied it. The Iraqi soldiers were absolutely stunned, and organized resistance soon crumbled. In fact, the Thunder Run tactic was directly credited with shortening the conventional war by at least several weeks and ultimately saving hundreds if not thousands of Allied soldiers' lives. Fast forward almost another 20 years to the war in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government is faced with a similar situation. Since the beginning of the invasion, the city of Kharkiv has been surrounded on 3 sides. Though the defenders of Kharkiv have been holding on, the government desired to break the siege and continued pushing eastward to eventually retake the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk. However, the Ukrainian government faced a big problem: a lack of troops. Because of the ongoing Kherson offensive, the Ukrainian government diverted large numbers of its most effective troops to the Kherson region. They needed a plan to make the most out of the limited number of experienced troops they had left. Though the plan was always to make its main strike in the east, the Ukrainian government needed the Russians to believe the Kherson region was their main target. To accomplish this, they moved large numbers of combat-hardened troops to the area to crack defenses there. But while preparations were being made for the Kherson offensive, the government was secretly planning the Kharkiv offensive. During the summer, the Ukrainians moved some of their best troops into the region, including the bulk of their special forces and battle-hardened units like the 92nd Mechanized Brigade. Knowing they lacked the raw numbers to overcome Russian defenses in the area, the Ukrainian High Command hoped to use speed, audacity, and aggression to counter the numerical superiority. Even though the Russians had moved the bulk of their forces away from the Kharkiv region and left mostly decimated units and National Guard units in their place, the Russian side still enjoyed a pretty steep numerical advantage. Looking at the playbook from the US invasion of Iraq, the Ukrainian government decided to replicate the Thunder Run tactic, but on a much bigger scale. The basic plan was this: the attack would come from 3 different directions, with one being launched from the east, one in the north, and one in the south. The northerly and southerly advances were to advance in that general direction, while the easterly advance would have the most difficult task. The eastern advance would have to break the back of the Russian defensive positions and generate enough panic to create a general rout. Once the Ukrainians had created a general rout, conventional units would follow up behind and hold the liberated territory. As for the columns themselves, they were instructed not to stop and keep advancing as far as they could go. To accomplish this, the columns were outfitted with tanks, armored vehicles, and civilian 4x4s that were meant to act as reconnaissance elements of the convoy. Over the course of several months, Ukrainian forces quietly accumulated all the equipment and personnel needed for the offensive. With a little over 10,000 troops and several hundred vehicles, the attackers would have to rely on speed and surprise to win the day, and that is exactly what they did. Late in the evening of September 6, the Eastern Column, made up of Special Forces troops and the 92nd Mechanized Brigade, left their starting point in the village of Praishib. After navigating the country roads, they quickly fell on their first target, the village of Virbivka, about 9 kilometers away. After a short but fierce fight, the Russians fled, and the column did not stop until they got to their next target of Balaklia, 5 kilometers away. This is an important area since it's a crossroads for several major regional highways and has a rail hub. Controlling this ensured Russian troops could not move freely to reinforce crumbling positions. After taking Balaklia, the convoy rumbled toward the villages of Volokiv Yar and Semenivka. Both of these villages were located along the T-2110 highway. The convoy continued advancing through the night and linked up with the National Guard units in the village of Shevchenkov. In just 36 hours of fighting, the column had gone an impressive 53 kilometers, and it wasn't stopping anytime soon. Once they wrestled control of the village, the convoy moved along the P07 highway, and they continued on to liberate several more villages along that highway, including the town of Rushivka. Here it was evident that the Russian forces were in full retreat, having abandoned tons of military equipment and supplies in the village to escape the area with their lives. The convoy continued on its primary objective to Kupiansk. The city had served as a significant logistical and command and control center for the Kharkiv region. After linking up with conventional troops, Ukrainian forces liberated the town by the evening of September 10th. In just 4 days, the Eastern Column had advanced an impressive 90 kilometers and liberated 5 villages and 2 cities by itself. The operation was an astounding success. As the Institute for the Study of War documented, by September 10th, the entire Russian army in the region was in a complete rout. The poorly equipped, led, and motivated troops fled for their lives without knowing where the Ukrainians would strike next. The defeat was so bad, its aftermath is what directly caused Putin to conduct his partial mobilization, resulting in 300,000 men being conscripted into the Russian military. But despite seeming like a no-brainer on paper, the operation was still very high risk. For example, Despite sending in some of the best troops Ukraine could muster, these troops were still highly isolated along the highways and villages. If the Russians had decided to put up a big enough fight, the convoys could have gotten bogged down and ultimately wiped out if Russian commanders had gotten reinforcements to the area on time. Additionally, the convoys enjoyed little air and artillery support. Though the Ukrainian Air Force still remains viable, it cannot commit its forces to a coordinated ground support role for an offensive operation. The rapid advance also meant that the convoys would quickly outrun the range of most friendly artillery systems by the end of the third or fourth day. Essentially, the Ukrainians hoped and actually achieved complete operational and tactical surprise. Russian commanders had been focused on the ongoing Kherson initiative and left the area around Kharkiv depleted of experienced troops and most heavy equipment. Russian forces behind the immediate front lines around Kharkiv were just trying to get their feet wet or recover in an area of the front that was less active. Instead, the gamble paid off, and the Ukrainian thunder runs absolutely stunned the Russian defenders. It appears that the Ukrainians employed the tried and true US tactic to a T and made it better by scaling it up to a much larger battlefield application. But despite being so successful, it's yet to be seen if Ukraine will replicate this winning strategy elsewhere in the country. As of right now, anything can happen. Now go check out how Russian tactics to take over Ukraine will backfire, or click this other video instead.